for you with just some fantastic speakers talking about what I think is just an incredibly important issue right now that we're reading about and seeing so much about, specifically the impacts of COVID-19 on women in our communities. Before we get started, just a couple of quick notes, just a couple of recognitions that I wanted to make. First, to our innovation partners. The Chamber's innovation partners are a group of our members who invest, and sorry, Maddie, I got ahead of you on that one. We'll go back in just a sec. Our innovation partners are those who invest in the mission of the Chamber and allow us to do our work related to small business development and entrepreneurship, talent development, and legislative advocacy. We are extremely grateful for their support throughout the year. We also have a set of media partners that help us share the great stories that are coming out of our region, the programs that we have, but even more importantly, what our members are doing, particularly as we move through recovery. So thanks again to our media partners. I neglected at the beginning because it's so new and we're so excited to welcome Danville Toyota as our 2021 presenting sponsor for all of our We Lead programming. Some of you may be familiar with Danville Toyota's Heels on Wheels initiative from a couple of years ago. They have long been passionate supporters of professional women and them developing their networks. And we're just so excited to have them as our presenting sponsor this year. So thanks to Teresa Wiseman and her colleagues at Danville Toyota. A note about the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine. We are trying to share this message loudly and broadly and hope you will pass it along. The site at JCPenney, which many of you probably have heard about, has capacity to vaccinate up to 3,000 people every day. You can register at the website or phone number there. They are also accepting walk-ins, so please encourage your family, your friends, and your colleagues to get vaccinated. Couldn't be easier in our region, and we're very grateful for the state's support there. And a note about your Chamber team. We're here to serve you. We're very excited to do that in a variety of ways and hope that you will reach out to any one of us should you have any questions, that your benefits of membership, upcoming programs. We're happy to talk with you about our work and all of the things that we can do to help your business or organization thrive. And finally, some upcoming events. We have our Chamber 101 tomorrow. Sounds like it's for beginners, but we welcome all of our members to learn about the most recent things happening at the Chamber and how you can make the most of your membership. Our 2021 legislative update with our senators and delegates will be on April 12th. And we have a double header on April 20th, beginning with our Workforce Summit. More information will be coming out in the next few days on that. And the next in this series is our We Read, where we'll be looking at burnout, and that will be facilitated by our former colleague, Rachel Covington. So very much looking forward to those programs and events. And at this point, we will go ahead and get started with our program. We're going to allow each of our presenters today to introduce themselves. We're thrilled. We have an all-star team, and I'm not on it, so I can objectively say that. Thrilled to first welcome a friend of to our region, Renee Haltom from the Richmond Federal Reserve. Renee, I know you want to share your screen, and we offer you our warmest welcome.
Thanks so much. And you're going to have my technical illiteracy on display for all to see. Bear with me for a moment while I share things. Hang on here. Now, let me know. Can you see my slides? Yes, good to go. Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be here. I was telling the group before we got started that Danville has a soft spot in my heart. I spent some good time there getting to know the people in the communities. I see a couple of familiar faces, which makes me smile. And so I'm just really thrilled to be here with you all. I wish it could be in person one day soon, we hope. My name is Renee Haltom, and I'm the regional executive at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in our Richmond office, which means that my job is to help us learn about what the economy is really doing on the ground so that when we go and make economic policy, we're informed by the richness and the color and the sort of disparities of experiences across business types and household types and regions. And it gives us a much richer picture than what we can get just from data alone. So, I've really been talking with a lot of people since the COVID crisis about how this has been affecting different households differently. I think a real hallmark of COVID is that it's not affecting people the same way. Some people are doing just fine and others really not. And so it's important for us to know that and how our policies affect them. And so that's sort of the lens I bring with you to you today. And certainly, you know, women in the labor force has been a big topic of focus since COVID broke out. And I'll go through some of the reasons why, but this is a really important topic. And before I dive in quickly, I have to give you the disclaimer that my views are mine and not those of the Federal Reserve. And that just means I get to say whatever I want. So with that, thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here. And then I'll be glad to take some questions at the end. So with that, let me attempt to go forward a slide. Yes, okay, great. So what you're seeing here is, let me change something on my screen quickly. So I think it helps to give an overview, sort of a big picture view of where we are right now in our economy after this COVID nightmare that we've been through. So what you're seeing is GDP, that is the broadest measure of economic activity that we have. And so when people say, how's the economy doing, they typically mean GDP. And usually I show this series in growth rates, but because of the dramatic things that we've experienced, the level actually tells you more. You can see that giant COVID drop that we experienced. And the upshot here, we've recovered a lot of what we lost in COVID in the overall economy sense. When all was said and done in 2020, we managed, despite a global pandemic, to produce 95% of what we did in 2019. And so that's nothing short of amazing. And I think really speaks to the resilience of the US economy. And by the way, this economic recovery has outpaced all expectations. Everyone was continually upgrading their forecasts as the year went on. So this is a recovery that is well underway, and that's a really good thing. But there are some caveats to that. We produced 95% of what we did before COVID, but with 9.5 million fewer workers. And so that's pretty remarkable. This chart shows the employment recovery. It's just the employment and levels. And you can see I put the monthly changes that we experienced there on the chart, just so you can see the massive swings that we've seen. Prior to COVID, a good jobs report would have added about 200,000 jobs a month. And here we were losing, millions all at once. And so that's just nothing short of remarkable. In the upshot here, I don't need to spend too much time on this, but our spending recovery has been very strong. Our employment recovery has been much less strong. We're seeing a spending recovery that is faster than the employment recovery. We've recovered more than 75% of the GDP losses that we experienced in COVID, but only over half, just around half of our employment losses, just a little more than that. So that's sort of the backdrop of what we're experiencing. And the hallmark of this crisis is that it has affected different sectors very differently, with the vast majority of the job hits of job losses in private services, specifically high touch services with limited ability to work remotely. So you can think hotels, restaurants, bars, retail, many healthcare practices, for example, that have shut down. So specifically, this chart shows employment in January of 2021. And I went to the pretty local level with the Greensboro MSA, that's the closest to Danville. And so that puts us back in January for data, because local data is always a little more lagged. So this shows employment in January relative to the previous year. Year over year is a common way of looking at things. And so these sectors, I've ordered them in terms of most important to the Greensboro MSA in terms of share of employment to least important. So trade, transportation, and utilities is one of the most important sectors, right? But information down at the bottom is less so to your region. And this just shows how each of those sectors, where their employment is relative to pre-COVID levels. So a couple of takeaways here. Sadly, every sector is down in employment. All the lines are in the negative territory. But you can see that leisure and hospitality really stands out as being by far the hardest hit. It's still down. I think it's nationally 22%. Relative to pre-COVID, that's still 3.5 million jobs still down in leisure and hospitality, or more than a third of the jobs were down total. And that also equates to about 78,000 jobs in Virginia. So a lot of disparities in terms of who was hit hardest. And because of the sectors that were most hurt, the losses were most likely to be felt by lower income workers. So this has really been a crisis that's just been super concentrated on certain groups, and many groups that are often already likely to be disadvantaged in some way. So this chart shows, again, where each sector is for the state of Virginia this time as a share of January 2020 employment. And again, the sectors are ordered this time by average weekly wage in 2019. So you've got the high wage sectors at the top of the chart and the low wage sectors at the bottom. Again, you can see that every sector is below where it was in pre-COVID, meaning that every sector is still down jobs. But the main point is that the biggest job losses are in those lower wage sectors. So the people least able to financially to weather it. The hardest hit sector, again, leisure and hospitality, is the lowest average wage of all these, and by far. And overall, we know that, and it's not shown on this chart, but the top 10% of workers, and those are workers making $85,000 and up, hardly saw employment losses in COVID. And now their employment levels are above pre-COVID levels, while the bottom 10% of workers, which is those making 30K and below, lost a third of jobs, and their employment is still down about 15%. So just a wide discrepancy in experiences. Okay, so that's the backdrop of what's been happening in the job market. And so now let's talk a little bit about who has been most affected. Pardon me here. So the most likely groups to have lost their jobs, or disproportionately likely to have lost their jobs, are minorities, the young, and the less educated. And that's shown on this chart. This chart shows unemployment rates for each of those groups. The green line at the bottom is the overall unemployment rate compared with the other groups that I've just mentioned. And the troubling thing is that gaps between these groups and the overall population had been coming down steadily leading up to COVID, if you can see that on the chart. And this is one of the chief benefits we heard about having a strong labor market, is that it typically helps people most on the sidelines of the labor market, many of whom are disadvantaged on the sidelines for some important reason. So specifically, if you look at the Black-white unemployment gap, sorry, I don't have the white unemployment rate here, but if you look at I can tell you that the Black-white unemployment gap spiked again in COVID after improving for many years. And it has come down a lot, but it's still quite high. The unemployment rate for the Black population is 4 percentage points higher than the unemployment rate for the white population. And so I know we're here to talk about women, and I haven't even mentioned them yet, and they're not on this chart. And there's a good reason for that. If I were to include women on this chart, their unemployment rate would be right on top of that national line, right on top of that green line. There's basically no difference, no discernible difference. Yet it is true that women have been hit harder in this recession. So how is that possible? Let me explain that. And this chart is one of the big reasons why. Women were more like, this is what I've done here is I did calculated women as a share of total employment. It's somewhat of a rough calculation, but nonetheless, you can see a big drop in COVID. Women were more likely to lose their jobs in COVID. And again, you can see that COVID hit. Women lost about 2 million more jobs in COVID than did men. And in other words, women lost 16% of payroll employment versus 13% for men. Now, thankfully, as the economy has opened back up, this gap has recovered a lot. Women are now down about 5 million jobs compared to about 4.4 million jobs for men. So still a gap, but it has come down quite a bit. And so that's a good thing. But another key problem remains, which is that many women have left the labor force entirely. And so when they leave the labor force, they are no longer looking for work, counted as looking for work. And so they're not counted in the unemployment rate at all. So if the unemployment gaps have kind of equalized, it misses the fact that many women have left the labor force. So there are now 2.5 million fewer women in the labor force compared to pre-COVID, compared to 1.9 million fewer men. So men have recovered over half of their drop in labor force participation, but women have recovered just 44%. And these gaps are largely driven by racial differences. So white women have actually recovered more of their COVID labor force declines relative to white men. But that's not true for Black women or for Hispanic women. So just to give you some numbers, we lost 719,000 Black women from the labor force in COVID, compared to 597,000 Black men. And Black men have recovered more than 3/4 of their COVID labor force participation losses, but Black women have recovered just 15%. We lost more than 1 million Hispanic women from the labor force, compared to 700 or so thousand for Hispanic men. Hispanic men have recovered 87% of those losses, but Hispanic women have recovered just 41%. So the upshot is there are still a lot of women who are out of the labor force, and we think that that's a problem. Okay, so the big question is, why have women been hit harder and why does it matter? So first, let's start with the why. Women, like youth, like people of color, are overrepresented in the hardest hit sectors. So those charts I showed you earlier about which sectors have been hit, that's leisure and hospitality and retail, education and health services. So that's a big part of the reason. But the losses for women extend even outside these sectors, so there has to be more to it. So what else is going on? So another factor is that for 2-income families, women earn less than men on average. So if you hold constant things like education and professional choice, about 92 cents on the dollar is what women earn. So if there's a need for dependent care, for example, often the economic choice to stay home falls on women. And obviously childcare has been a huge strain in COVID, with schools being remote and many childcare centers closed or operating at reduced capacity. So recently I talked with, I mentioned that part of my job is to speak with business leaders. Recently, I talked to the CEO of a national beauty supply chain, and this person noted that they're really not seeing displaced salon workers. Many salons shut down or reduced capacity, and they're not really seeing those displaced salon workers go solo or find new jobs. And he pointed out that salon workers are often second earners in their families. So this person suspected that it's not going to be until the school year starts in September and schools are hopefully open with a bit more consistency that that group of workers will even come back. And that's a story that I've heard in many places, that it's just some people saying, you know what, I'm just going to take this time and be with my family while childcare is a strain, rather than try to come up with some creative or convoluted solution. And then once we're on the other side of this, then I'll go back looking for work. But even that doesn't cover all of it. I think the final piece is that regardless of income, and the women on the phone will probably know this firsthand, regardless of income, women tend to bear a larger burden of childcare and what we call as economists home production. Women spend 30% more time per day on household activities on average, and mothers spend twice the number of hours caring for children as fathers. And economists like to point out that all of this is unpaid labor, but it's labor nonetheless. And in particular, when kids went back to school in September of 2020, another 669,000 women dropped out of the labor force, compared to just 71,000 men. And so certainly that's not true for every household. In fact, I in particular, I think, come from a particularly equal household in terms of those responsibilities being shared, but on average, it's what's in the data. And so what I want to point out and argue to you and hopefully convince you, I don't think I need to convince anyone on the call today, but that female participation in the labor force matters. For one thing, I think we can all agree that female role models and perspective in the workplace really matter. COVID took us back to 1987 levels in terms of female labor force participation, which I think we can agree is not a place we want to stay for a variety of reasons. Another reason females in the labor force matters is that because I still hear every day from employers, even with 9.5 million people still out of work, or more jobs lost, jobs not filled in COVID, jobs lost in COVID, I still hear every day from employers that they can't find enough workers to meet demand. And at the Fed, we really care about this because it's simple math. Every model that we have tells us this. How fast our economy can grow is a product of how many workers we have and how productive they are. And so if we want economic recovery, and moreover, we want an economy that's continually growing, we need more workers. We just simply can't afford to have people on the sidelines. And then there's, of course, the impacts personally on women in terms of their careers, their engagement, and what they want for their lives. And no one's going to begrudge a woman the choice to stay home if that's what she chooses to do. But if it's for economic reasons, then that may not be quite the optimal choice. And so there's a lot to do here in terms of recovery. Getting women re-engaged in the labor force is essential, and there are some challenges on the table now to doing that. Obviously, getting kids back to school will be part of that. And more generally, solving childcare availability issues as well as dependent care generally. That's going to be a key issue. There's also significant mismatch in the labor force right now. So a mismatch means a few different things. At the biggest picture level, it means a mismatch between the jobs that are available and the workers available to fill them. And some of that is geographic. So because the market that I cover is Virginia, and I think a lot about furniture manufacturers in rural Virginia and laid off restaurant workers in Virginia Beach. Geographically, you can't move the laid off restaurant worker over to that manufacturing plant super easily. Their skills may not also transfer. There might have to be some training involved, and that's not a seamless process. But increasingly, I'm also hearing about preference mismatch, is that people don't necessarily want to make that shift to the jobs that are available. I've heard stories about different manufacturing plants, for example, trying to hire laid off restaurant workers, and they find that they don't want the hours because those hours either are just not, they don't match with their lifestyle, or maybe they don't work with childcare. There are lots of stories about that type of mismatch. So I think that's going to be an issue for us to try to solve going forward. There are some bright spots. Everything I've described to you does not mean to me that the gains of the last 30 years for women in the labor force have been erased. It is conceivable that the way COVID has hit the labor force won't stick with us in quite the same way that normal recessionary forces do. For example, if someone's out of a job for 6 months or more, it is notoriously harder for them to ever get another job. Employers kind of look at that as sort of a ding on their resume. I don't know, is that going to be viewed the same way in a COVID environment where we all understand the reasons for it? So I'm not sure all those gains are completely lost. Fortunately, we are having much different conversations about equity and other issues in the workforce today. And I think that's going to be something that will help our recovery, one hopes, about equity, flexibility, and especially the necessity of childcare and how to make that more affordable and accessible. I haven't seen any silver bullets on the childcare front in terms of how to address that. I know some of our other panelists today are experts in that area. But because of COVID, at least people will no longer question the necessity of childcare. And then finally, I think we are facing just a more flexible future that may help women and working parents generally. We've just run a massive experiment in terms of sending everybody home. It never would have worked if just one firm had done it. But it was not just your company, it was your whole company, but it was your clients and your vendors, it was everybody. And we've realized it can work way better than we ever imagined. And so few employers that I talk to think that they're going to stay at the present levels of remote work, but many don't think they're going back to pre-COVID levels either. It's just going to be greater flexibility going forward. And that's got to be something that helps women in the labor force. And I'm all wrapped up here, but I just wanted to point out one more thing, which is that I'm concerned about employed women too. I think there's just a tremendous amount of stress going on these days for everybody. Humanity someone's at my door. Humanity as a whole, just in terms of juggling work-life balance. Apologies for the dog. I'll just mention that I sat in a presentation just yesterday from ADP, which is a global payroll processing firm, and they shared some recent survey results that they did. They cited that 85% of workers right now are concerned about job security. 22% are doing work that they are not fully comfortable doing given the health risks involved. 25% of workers are working on non-work days. workers are giving their employers more free time, and meaning just working longer hours, both because they're worried about keeping their jobs and because they may have lost workers because of COVID quarantines. And so people are working harder, they're juggling more work and life, and they've had their creature comforts removed. And so I think stress is something that we have to take really seriously for all people in the labor force. And I think it is hitting women harder in some ways. And that is certainly the sentiment that I hear when I talk with business leaders. They are very concerned about the morale of their workers and really thinking harder about that than they ever have. And I think of that as a real bright spot. So with that, I will pause and thank you very much.
Thanks, Renee. It's the perfect segue into, I think, Jim's remarks and what he's going to share. And I love that your doorbell rang, because I think it's the perfect example of the world we're living in right now, and what many of us, predominantly women, but men too, are dealing with on a daily basis: dogs and cats and children and doorbells and all of those things, and how we can integrate that efficiently and effectively, I think will be an ongoing struggle, but one that we're all here to talk about. So before I turn it over to Jim, just a reminder, if you have questions for our panelists, I hope you will put those in the chat, and we will get to those after our speakers finish today. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Jim Bebeau, who's the Executive Director of Danville, Pittsylvania Community Services.
Hi, thank you, Alexis. It's great to follow for Renee, because she set up a lot of statistics that I was going to touch on. So that might make me talk less today, and you might appreciate that. So Alexis asked me to talk about mental health. And so my background is I'm a licensed therapist, and now I'm an administrator of our organization. And so what I wanted to try to touch base with, based on what Alexis told me to talk about, so was to look at the last 12 months and how our company as a workforce worked through the pandemic, especially because our workforce is about 80% female. And then as part of that, what are some ways that all of us can look at our mental health and how it was affected by the pandemic and what we can do about it? Because male or female, it affected all of us. So I'm going to jump into just noting that all the statistics that Renee went over are the same statistics I found about how the pandemic affected all of us in many ways: isolation, increased stress, and the things that we need to talk about for women are very different, because women have a different role in our society, much, 1950s traditional stuff, homemakers, raising children, and things like that. So I'm going to hit on a couple of those points today. So what makes mental health really matter now and makes it an issue is because a pandemic is a disaster. And when we think about disasters, we think about tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, things that we identify as natural disasters. And people that go through those things have a significant impact in their whole lives about that. And so the thing that's really unique about a pandemic is it started a year ago and we are still in it. A hurricane happens in a day or two and you're done, and you deal with the tragedy and the things that happen, but then you immediately start coming out of that into a recovery mode. We're not out of that yet. We're still in it for 6 months. And so the fact that we're stuck in it is really ugly and distressing for all of us. And we hope, we're all done with this. We're ready to get back outside. We're done with Zoom meetings. We're ready to move on, but we just can't do it quite yet. So, there are things that you feel, think, and act differently after a natural disaster, and in this case, the pandemic. Especially more intense reactions, because we are all in this, and no matter where we live or what we do, it's affected us. And then on top of that, it might be even more intense. So if you've been in a community where you have higher instances of COVID, or people that you yourself or people in your family that have had COVID, if you've had mental health or behavioral health issues before, or physical health issues before the pandemic, or substance use issues, they may be exacerbated in the pandemic. I know personally, I have two sisters that live in New York City, one in the city and one out of the city. Their experience is vastly different than me down here in Southside Virginia. And I've heard them tell the stories, and they will struggle differently than we will. So the takeaway there is that none of us are like experimenters looking at this from the outside, watching through a glass dome saying, well, how are these people going to deal with this thing? We are all part of this thing. There is no separation of who's dealing with this and who's not, because we all are. And so the reality of that is, I wanted to talk to you today as a husband and a father and an employer, to tell you how how we lived it down here in Southside Virginia. The statistics work for us too. Everything Renee said is appropriate for us as well. So the first thing I want to tell you is that we are all in this. The last 12 months have been awful for all of us in so many ways. But I want you to hear that we're all in this together. And that's an important part, that we are all touched equally, or maybe not equally, but we are all touched by this pandemic. And it is a tragedy. And the unfortunate thing is that we don't perceive this like another disaster. You know, you can have a hurricane hit Florida. If you don't have anybody that you know that lives in that part of Florida, or no connection, you know, our heart goes out and we're empathetic to the situation. But it's old news in a couple of days. It's not the same for us. I mean, we hear in the paper every day. We know people that this happens to. And, you know, it's touched our lives in so many ways, and in all the circles in our lives, our faith circles, our family circles, our school circles, our work circles. So you can't get away from it. It's constantly in your face. And that just continues to add to the stress. And when you continue to build stress up like that and you don't have a relief, it puts you in this heightened sense of awareness that's hard to back off of, especially if you have school-age children and you've got so many other complications to how you have to struggle on a day-to-day basis. It's just unrelenting is the word. So with all of that, I want to tell you that this is our reality. It is our new normal. And we have to accept that, but we don't have to like it. And no, this is not the time to say, suck it up and deal. It is the time to say it's okay not to be okay right now, and ask and talk to others in your circles to help you out. And so I'm gonna give you some ideas how to do that. So as an employer in the community, we're a healthcare organization. We provide behavioral health and developmental disability services to the city and the county. And so I can tell you for the last 12 months, I've done nothing but think about business operations. One, because our company has to serve our community. There are people whose literal lives depend on what we do. We're not doing surgery or things like that, but we do make a difference in a lot of people's lives. We run a lot of residential programs. It's 24/7 care. And so there was no option for us. We had to keep on working. And as you heard me say earlier, 250 plus of our 300 employees are women, and they had different issues than the men. You know, they had childcare, they had school-age children that all of a sudden weren't in school anymore. So what did we do as an employer to make a difference there? And these are things that if you haven't done it, you can take it back to your workplaces. Some of it's old hat now that we're a year into this stuff, but it's important to understand things can be done. We can think out of the box. As Renee said, work from home is a new normal for us, and we just rip that Band-Aid right off and realize that it can be done. So I have a family too. Not only did I have to think about work, I got a teenager at home that was, you know, ripped from his social network as a teenager in high school, and that was hard, and that put stress on all of us. So what do? We talk to each other. You know, I talk to my spouse all the time about stuff. We all count on our spouses. I talk to my peers that do my job around the state. I have a whole team of coworkers here at the office, and we sit around and commiserate every day about how much this sucks. But at the end of the day, we decided the thing we can do is control what's in our bailiwick and make a difference at work for the people that we have to serve and for our workforce. So control what you can. That's the takeaway from that. So we did a lot of really creative things to help our coworkers. Some of them are the simplicity of just acknowledging, hey, we get it. We're right there with you. We understand. So we had two goals. We wanted to continue our operations, and we don't want to have any adverse staffing. You know, we have 300 plus positions here. We didn't want to have furloughs or layoffs, and we needed to keep our workforce intact to keep doing our widgets. And so, you know, within a week's time, we converted 150 employees to being able to work from home and put telehealth online. Normally, those people are out in the community all day, every day, going around seeing folks and doing the things that they do to help them. All of a sudden, you can't do that in a pandemic. So we had no choice but to just continue moving that. But then the other half of our workforce, they still had to come in and do things, residential care staff, emergency staff. So we had to do unique things for that part of our staff as well. So here's some of the creative things we try to do. And remember, we were trying to do everything we could to keep the workforce intact, to provide the critical service that we provide, and to not have everybody throw rotten tomatoes at us every day because we just weren't understanding. So we put work from home in place for everybody. We gave directions to our supervisors to be absolutely the most flexible you can with somebody's schedule and do whatever you can do to let that person have the time that they need and still make the widget that your program has to make. We put hazard pay in place for staff that were in critical positions that we really needed them to come on into work for their shift. We tried to do things that if people were exposed or had quarantine issues, that we put flexible benefits in place for them, such as paid leave. We were really liberal with our leave policies. We even let people, they could run a negative leave balance if they needed to. So we just did everything we could. And remember, we're a public agency, so we had to be very mindful of how we spend our public dollars, but we felt it was critical to do those things. We put a hazard bonus for everybody in. Hell, there were even a couple of times we bought lunch for everybody and just said, we're buying you lunch. Come on, guys. We appreciate what you do. So we say all that, trying to balance those demands of having our necessary workforce in place and keeping staff healthy and resilient. And so the key word there is resilient. And so how do you translate into your personal life and your mental health? So everybody knows we have to be resilient, and it's necessary in everything we do, both at work and in our home lives. And, you know, it's kind of like a well that you go and draw from when you're feeling depleted, and it rebounds your efforts and your abilities and your patience and your calmness to deal with the chaos in the outside world around you. The problem is 12 months into a disaster, your well might be depleted and you're struggling to replenish that. And so without diving into a whole bachelor's degree course on psychology and how the mind works and how that's a problem, I'm gonna give you a couple of little tidbits to be looking for yourself, for the people in your circle, for your coworkers, your family. So when you go through a disaster like this, there are often times where your thinking changes. You know, you might have trouble sleeping at night. You may have a nightmare about things. You may have difficulty concentrating at work. And then your feelings are affected, and everybody knows what they are. You may be more anxious about things. You may have depression. You may be more irritable. You may be snappy with the people in your lives. Those are all that's your way of reacting to the situation that you're in. Behavior changes. You may get in arguments with others. You may be having some survival guilt by eating too much or too little. You may be tearful more often. You might get angry and outburst. You may find yourself using substances as coping mechanisms. There's nothing wrong with a cocktail, but when you use it as a crutch, it becomes problematic. Of course, we all know that our mind and our body are connected, so you may find physical signs of going along with that, like headaches and loss of appetite and GI issues, low energy. All those kind of things are things to be looking out for that may be flags that you need to think about how well you're dealing with your stress, because all of us are going to be measured differently with our stress level. So I think it's important today too, since we're talking to the issues for women. You know, all of us have a mother. Our mothers were women, and we need to talk about how to deal with our kids. And so kids are not just small little packaged adults. They are very, very different when they deal with their emotions and how they react to the world. And it just squirts out very differently. So I'm going to give you some tips to look for whatever age group you might have as kids for how to help them, because kids cannot articulate their feelings like adults can. So if you have little ones that are under 5, they may constantly be fearful and worrying. They may be clingy and always attached to you at the hip. The floor is on fire, you know, that kind of stuff. You got to be holding them. They may have trouble sleeping, may have nightmares. They may even regress to some of those early 0 to 2 behaviors like bedwetting and fear of the dark. So those are signs and symptoms to look out for your kid that they may not be dealing well with this. If you've got a kid in the elementary, middle school years, you know, 6 to 11, they may get withdrawn from others in activities. They may have outbursts that are, you know, not typical for them. They may struggle with their concentration. Irritability is big. Now, most middle school kids are irritable anyway, but it would be more so than what you're used to. They may be doing poorly in school, not just because of the virtual reality of school or the virtual education system. And then if you got teenagers, 12 to 17, besides them being this early bunch that we're used to, they all got ripped from their social environments. They are struggling with how to adjust. You know, teenagers, their job is to start becoming individuals and pulling away from their family to be independent and go off in the world and do things. And then we've taken that ability away from them. And then they're struggling with, they don't have their normal peer groups to talk to. You may see some more risky behaviors. They may start misusing drugs or alcohol. So if you're a parent and you see any of these things, talk to anybody you want to talk to that may help you get through that. Certainly our agency offers those services, and that's what we do for the public. So, model good behavior and get support. So let me tell you a couple of quick little things and then I'll be done that can help you. So for resiliency, the thing we need to do is recharge and refill that well. And the way you do that is you maintain your connections, keep your circles going, have your close relationships, whether it's at work, at school, at church, the neighborhood group, whatever it might be, keep those connections, because just the ability to talk to somebody else about how bad your day was might be just cathartic enough that it depletes most of that stress that you built up all day. And when that doesn't work, then you come looking for, either your faith-based services or your professional services that can help you walk through when you can't reduce that stress level in your life. Find some purpose, some time to reflect, maybe find new things that are important to you since we're living in a pandemic and you got to do things differently. Be flexible, but kind of keep a routine in your life, especially with some isolation that we experience. It's a little easier now, 12 months in it with some restrictions coming out, but 6 months ago, people really needed to be mindful about what their routines were, because having a routine keeps you healthy. There's a famous guy, I can't think of his name right now, in the military that talks about he makes his bed up every day. This is a man in charge of moving troops around the world and doing some pretty horrible things of war. But he said he made his bed up every day because it was a successful decision that he executed every morning. So something simple like that can be very, very therapeutic. Manage your thoughts. In therapy, we call that stinking thinking. Try not to think about, sorry, Siri, you want to talk to me there about that. Try not to think and let your mind spin out of control about that, and stay focused on the here and the now. Talk to the people around you to help you go, is this something I should be worried about? Get that reality check. Of course, always everybody knows meditate, deep breathing, take a walk outside, take your dog for a walk. If you don't have a dog, get a dog or a cat. Things like that will help you find other ways. Just rubbing your dog or rubbing your cat will make your blood pressure go down. I think a big one is to be careful about social media. It can be both helpful and connecting, and it can also be toxic. So just kind of keep that in moderation. That will add to your stress level. You'll go reading Facebook posts and your blood pressure will just go up. You can see it. So know when to check out on that stuff. Of course, have a sense of humor, watch a funny movie, eat healthy snacks, make sure you drink plenty of water. And that's it. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There are whole classes about how to deal with stress levels, but that's enough to kind of just give you some tidbits. If you want to connect offline, we're always available. We have an emergency line 24 hours a day. So we're here for our community and whatever you might need. And I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. And remember, try to keep that well replenished and keep your resiliency strong.
Jim, thank you so much. I think the thing I'll share with the group that I've struggled with maybe the most is giving myself permission to realize that this is not normal, that I shouldn't be functioning as I normally function as a parent, as a professional, as a friend. It's challenging for all of us because we're doing everything we were used to doing, but in a pandemic. And I think that's what I've kind of forgotten about. And, as I turn it over to Anne, she and I have talked about that too, that we have to give ourselves, we're giving others grace. I think we've done quite well at that. We need to give ourselves some grace as well. So we will heed your words and appreciate that so much. And everyone, keep the questions coming in. We're getting great questions, so please keep those coming in. We will have some time to devote to those. So with that, I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Anne Stratton, our Executive Director at Smart Beginnings, Danville, Pennsylvania.
Hi, everybody. It's so fun just to be with a big group of women, and Jim, in parentheses, and Jim. First I want to thank Alexis because, we lead is a big deal. It's really awesome, especially now more than ever, to give women a way to convene. And I love, Alexis, that you've invited Renee from the Federal Reserve. For those of you who don't know, this is a real opportunity, if you're that person that's really worried about the state of the world, this is one of these actually very specific ways inviting Renee and having this opportunity for her to hear the real world perspective when we get to the questions and conversations today is really an amazing opportunity. And for those of you that don't know, Smart Beginnings is one of 17 school readiness coalitions in Virginia. Our mission is to strengthen the system of individuals and organizations serving children aged birth to 5. So we do work with childcare providers, preschool programs, service partners, and parents. So I hope to touch on that a little bit today to tell you what we're hearing and seeing. You know, and I want to thank Jim, for acknowledging that this is in fact a disaster. You know, I think I'm guilty sometimes of just getting through it and surviving it because we've remained open. And I loved what Renee said about nobody is experiencing this the same way. For 5 people that have renovated their house, there's 5 more people that have worked double the workload since this began. And it's healthcare workers. And in our market, this wasn't true across the state, but in Danville, Pittsylvania County, the majority of childcare providers never closed. And Lord knows parenting never closed. So, you know, for people who have been trying to work and raise children in the middle of a pandemic, my hat's, you know, off to you. So thank you, Jim, because I think that normalizes the seriousness of it all. And I do think it's super important to remember that everybody is experiencing this in a different way. So just briefly, you know, what are we hearing and learning about families? You know, pre-pandemic, families were vulnerable for lots of complicated reasons, you know, and in a region like ours, a lot of that is economic. And, you know, decades of poverty and other really serious issues that we haven't solved yet. And the pandemic has just made it worse. We've learned a lot about, and this maybe is a good thing, I'm not sure. I think for folks that thought childcare had nothing to do with them, they now know if you want your ER physicians and your firefighters to show up for work, that childcare actually affects everybody and is for sure an economic development issue. What we now know more than ever is that society is going to have to invest in stable, accessible, ideally high quality childcare for all children. And we know there's equity issues. We knew there were quality issues before. We still have quality issues. And we know that parents need, you know, help and support. Again, pre-pandemic, parenting was not easy. And now it's tougher than ever. So locally, regionally, you know, our response last fall, we worked really hard to raise over $1 million on a state allocation to provide emergency childcare support. That was not a national benefit. It wasn't even a statewide benefit. There were only a handful of markets that have received that. So we're now funding over 300 Safe Place to Learn scholarships. And I mention that because, you know, Renee is on the call and she probably knows this was not awarded throughout the state, but I want to mention what a difference it made. In a society and any community where people have to work and schools close, I mean, how we don't get yet that teachers are as important as nurses and doctors. And people have to go to work. And we were hearing about 10-year-olds caring for 3-year-olds and 3-year-olds caring for 2-year-olds. We knew this had to happen. And that's why we fought as hard as we did to get the funding, because when parents are at work and they're only in school 1 or 2 days a week, or they're not in school at all, disaster is the word. You know, nobody saw this coming, but I hope to God, if this ever happens again, that we are more prepared to deal with the reality that for some people, work is not an option for many, many reasons. That might be an economic reason, or it might be I'm an ER doc, or I'm a nurse, or I'm a pharmacist, or I'm a cashier at the local grocery store, right? We have a lot of people that actually have to go to work and deserve to have young children and a safe place for their kids to learn and grow. So this is a I think a historical event that is going to lend itself hopefully to improvements across the 0 to 5 system. So, another thing that we were fortunately able to do in Southside Virginia is provide very COVID pandemic related specific technical assistance and support to our child care providers who have also been insanely stressed out, worried about their own health, worried about their employees. I mean, you're talking about a sub-industry of people who make minimum wage, who largely don't have child care, who had to stay open and function during the pandemic for economic reasons. And frankly, I think they just stepped up. They're really some of the unsung heroes because they wanted to be, a part of response, so to speak. So that's the sad story of what I'll talk about. But in that story, I also hear tremendous opportunity. And I do. I think that, the way we talk about tragedy, disaster, those thoughts feed our emotions. So for me, one of the ways to keep the emotional train from going off the tracks and into the Atlantic Ocean is to revisit the story. And so as painful and as stressful as this has all been, I think there is opportunity unlike any other. And I do think it's time to start creating the time and the space, whether that's at the individual level, whether it's for the company you run, to create real legitimate space for recovery planning, right? If we don't do that, what we're going to do is just trip back into a lot of the same problems we had pre-pandemic. So my hope is that we now acknowledge that recovery planning, to Jim's point again, that this was a real disaster. This was no different than a community that's been completely ripped up by a tornado or whatever, but you have to have time and right talent and capacity to think through how do we heal from this? How do we come out stronger from this? So some of the categories that I think deserve a dedicated, legitimate recovery plan to continue this conversation and really close the loop on stabilizing and improving the quality of childcare and increasing access. Not high quality childcare for some, high quality childcare for all. The time has come. And that is not to belittle the role of the parent. The parent is every child's first teacher, but we have to have this partnership with parents and childcare providers. Certainly the learning loss for our children. Personally, I think that public education needs to hire corporate experts. I think this is well beyond anybody's head at this point. And we need to form teams that will work side by side with public education for the next 3 years to think through as pragmatically as we can, what will it look like to address the real learning loss, not just academically, but emotionally for our children. I think that the impact of this is 3 to 5 years. And I think if those plans are not thought out, implemented, and funded, we'll see that also negatively impact the economy for years to come. And also, I think that this gives us an opportunity as a society to rethink mental health. When we talk about healing for our children and our families and our communities, the types of services that Jim and the CSB and others offer, basic mental health is really important. But I think we're on the cusp of normalizing mental health. It's not just for the crazy, right? That building your resilient muscles, you may have been like the happiest person on planet Earth pre-COVID. And maybe what COVID taught you is that anybody can end up on their knees mentally disrupted. And it's time to normalize building our resiliency, healing, whether it's this or whatever it is. And I think that also needs real strategic planning and resourcing and partnership, public-private partnership, to think through what it's going to look like to have real healing support for our children, our families, and our community. And then, back to what Renee said about everybody is experiencing this pandemic so differently. to me, part of equity and inclusion and healing is to really acknowledge the employed and the unemployed. If I were going to categorize two groups of experiences so differently, for people who had to keep working and coexist between homeschooling, working, and yada, versus the person who went to bed at night worried, oh my God, how am I going to pay for the next meal? I.e. lost my job, lost my income, with no real quick solution in sight. We have to come together, and the unemployed that's my problem too. It's not my problem because I didn't lose my job. I think real healing for a community says, how do we circle the wagons and really move forward with a more inclusive mindset? So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully if you all have any questions, Alexis will bring that up. But again, I just really encourage everybody to see this opportunity to connect with Renee, knowing that she's a bridge to the Federal Reserve, which is designing part of these recovery efforts that we're talking about. So great to see everybody. Hang in there. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
And thank you so much. It's just fantastic. Thank you, Jim, for that as well. We do have some great questions I know we want to get to. I just think all of this is so important. And Jim, I think you've really put a fine point on this being a disaster. I know that's one of the kind of emerging takeaways for me from the day, because I don't know that personally that I've thought about it. I mean, it's a crisis, but this is a long crisis.
It's a 12-month crisis.
Longer than normal. So Renee, I want to send the first question to you. The question is how we're recovering GDP, spending, and employment at such very different rates.
That is a phenomenal question. So there's a lot of different things going on there. A big part of, and this happens in every recession, but it certainly happened more intensely in this one, is that businesses find ways to do more with less. I'm hearing a lot of stories about efficiencies, finding different, trimming fat in a way in some processes. That's one way, just finding efficiencies. I've heard about cutting this production line that, they thought for 10 years they've been wanting to do it, but in recessions, businesses tend to make those calls, and they can kind of blame it on the economy in some sense. It's an easy time to make those calls, those harder calls. So that's certainly one way of doing it. Another way is that businesses have found efficiencies from the environment we're operating in. That's not true across the board. COVID has increased costs for many businesses. If you have any kind of in-person facility or operation going on, you now have to sanitize and distance, and that costs a lot of money. But a lot of businesses, for example, they're not traveling. They don't have travel budgets, for example. So that's freeing up some resources in different ways, or people are not spending time doing the things that they used to do because they can't go out in person and travel. So there's just a lot of finding efficiencies that way that are enabling firms to kind of do more with less. Another big part of it is the spending side of things. GDP is ultimately spending. And because of fiscal policy, there is a lot more money on average on people's household balance sheets than there used to be. The savings rate went through the roof in COVID. That in recessions, normally people kind of don't have much capacity to save, but now we've expanded unemployment, and we've sent checks, and savings rates for all income levels actually are up. Now that doesn't mean some people are really on the fringe, right? Because the bottom income quartile, say, still has a very, very low component in that. So that's by no means to say that everyone's doing just fine, but government has been a big part of that spending apparatus. And that's another thing that accounts for those differences. So I think a key thing going forward will be, when do businesses bring the jobs back? And do they bring the same level of jobs back?
Yep. Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. To a complicated question, I think, well, for the lay people on the call, to a relatively complicated question. So thank you for making it palatable for us. Jim, question, are there anticipated long-term effects from the limited socialization of children as a result of quarantine? And what can parents do to help mitigate these effects?
I think the simple answer is yes. I think there will be people that will write their doctoral theses on this lost generation, if you will. I don't think it means that there's no hope. I think they'll just talk about how this changed things for us, because I think the way we grow our kids in America is they go to school and they do this and they do that, and we hit a gigantic speed bump. It wasn't a month we missed things; it's a year now, and I think there will be struggles for that. The oversimplified response is to love your children, keep them in your lives, let them know that it's okay to feel the way they're feeling about these things. Normalizing it is an oversimplification, but children are extremely resilient. You think about children that are abused and neglected and how resilient they are. So they're still very much elastic at that age. And so being there for them and helping them through it, they'll recover more quickly sometimes than adults.
Thank you.
Well, I'll add on to that
Yeah,
too.
please.
I think it's really important. There are families that have gone to the beach and gone to the mountains, but you can't talk about it like that, because you got to talk about it, things that everybody can do. But to step away, if you've been so afraid of COVID, now more than ever, go to the park. Go drive an hour away to any park, because I think for children in particular, if they've absorbed this fear and the stress, stepping away from it and giving it some fresh air and some sunshine, especially now that the weather is turning nice, I would say for the adult, but don't forget your kids too. If there's any chance at all, just to step away as a physical reminder that we're actually not trapped in our homes forever, and not trapped in our heads. So for whatever that's worth, I think that's just so important now.
And I want to stay with you because you've been on the front lines of this particular issue for years. Do you feel that there's a shortage of childcare providers in our region? That's the question. And I'll kind of do a part B to that. How did the pandemic exacerbate that?
Right. So yes and no. In the city of Danville, we're okay on private childcare. We need more family day homes. We don't really have shift work care, weekend care, sick care. In the county, and I will add on most rural counties, Halifax, Mecklenburg, Charlotte, Lunenburg, Brunswick, there is an absolute shortage, and there's been a shortage for 0 to 3 in infant care for a long time. And I have to add on as a distinct category, accessible, affordable access to high quality. So now finally in Virginia, you have a level rating system. It's not okay that some of our hardest working citizens cannot afford a reasonable standard of care, health, safety, emotionally responsive adults. It's a real missed learning opportunity when we don't invest in that as a society. So there's absolutely childcare deserts in Southside, in particular in Pittsylvania County. There's an absence of affordability, and then there's an absence of flexible shift care, for one, let alone sick care, weekend care. Yes, so there's both.
Yeah.
What we're doing okay in Virginia, I think, is with publicly funded 4-year-old preschool. I mean, there is a gap, but for most parents that want access to high quality, publicly funded preschool for 4-year-olds, Head Start and the Virginia Preschool Initiative are able to serve a lot of kids. That also varies in Virginia. We're very fortunate in Danville and Pittsylvania County that we have school boards that have budgeted for the local contribution to those Virginia preschool slots. That's not the case across Virginia, but we're very fortunate in Danville, Pittsylvania County.
Thank you. Renee, I want to come back to you. The question is, many sectors received extensive guidance on mandatory and best practices to implement while maintaining operations throughout the pandemic. There's a noted gap in continuity of services guidance as it pertains to hospitality and leisure. Moving forward, would increased guidance from the state and federal levels help to influence the recovery of this sector?
So this, I think, is about, telling restaurants you can be open at half capacity or a third capacity, and I think it certainly is something that would enable certain restaurants are facing, that is a binding constraint for them. right, to how much they can be open. I've traveled to a few different areas in COVID, not very many, and I've felt very big differences in different places. I was in North Carolina last weekend visiting family, and a restaurant there looked very different than a restaurant in Virginia. So certainly that's a difference in some places. I don't think that's the only binding thing, though. Certainly culture is a big factor. There are parts of the country, because I do outreach all over. Or all over Virginia, even just within Virginia, there are parts of the state where no one will go to a restaurant, and it's very, it's just a more hesitant culture about it. And that's been true throughout the pandemic. And there are other places where there's just a different cultural response, and people are much more willing to be there. So I think that's one part of the question of whether these businesses can reopen. Another question is labor force. And one of the really interesting things I've observed is that just because a lot of the job losses have occurred in leisure and hospitality, it doesn't mean that if a restaurant opens, they can immediately find workers. The number of restaurants and hotels and retailers that have told me they have job openings and people won't come back. And that's, I wouldn't say that that's across the board. There are some places where it's going just fine. You hear varied reports. But I do hear a lot that for some places it's, they're trying to bring back their workers, and they're saying, well, I've got, I'm legitimately afraid of getting COVID, and I don't have a vaccine yet. I've got some added unemployment benefits for now, and childcare is a real struggle anyway. So if you add all that together, it's just not worth it to me to come back now. So I think that is something that is hindering the leisure and hospitality response. So it's a legitimate question. What level does that sector recover to in the end? I think most people expect it will be smaller, but then, once we're really on the other side of this, do different restaurants crop up in their place and increase the size of that sector again? I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
That's right. I hadn't considered, we talked a lot about the original stipend that went with unemployment being a challenge for leisure and hospitality specifically. We talked about a number of factors, but I personally hadn't considered the culture piece. I think that's a really important point. The next question is for all of you, and Jim, I want to start it with you, and then we can just go to Renee and Anne. How do you anticipate this pandemic recovery mode differing from the recovery efforts prompted by natural disaster?
Well, there's the obvious things that, we're not having to rebuild buildings and get rid of the charred remains of, forest fires and things like that. So it's really about rebuilding our people and our trust in our communities, because as you talked about, the trust and the culture of some restaurants open and some not, and the workforce doesn't want to return yet because they know they'll be right out there with people that are doing things that put them at risk. And so I think that for me, that would be the first thing to focus on is being comfortable as a society. Nobody's spoken about it today, but the politics of this were really polarizing, and a lot of us got on different sides of things, and we'll have to rebuild those bridges so we're more comfortable, and people are entitled to different opinions, and you don't need to be angry with them about it. You just accept it for what it is. And if you don't get past it, we'll continue to have cultural divides. And so we'll need to work on those things as well.
I think that it's in a lot of ways just far more complex. And so again, what comes to my mind is whether it's childcare, let alone public education, we talk about public-private partnership all the time. At this point, I don't think it's an option anymore. I think we have got to bring corporate level experience and thinkers to this crisis in public education. We had a crisis pre-pandemic, and now we need to, there's going to be state and federal crisis response funding. But if it's not thoughtfully designed with a 3, 5, 7, 10-year mindset that embeds mental health supports and accessible, meaningful after school and summer remediation, it's going to be what we've been doing for decades, which is just slinging mud. Ooh, let's do a program. Let's help 30 people. Let's help 50 people. That my hope is that one of the greatest things to come out of this is that the recovery and remediation will be advanced, well-funded, inclusive, equitable, and really move this country along where it means something again to have a high quality, public education experience. And I think this is the opportunity. What concerns me is if we don't make space for the planning process in the infrastructure process, and we just dump funding on already stressed public school administrators, we're going to miss it, because they were already stressed, and now you're going to add on pandemic recovery task, right? It's like a whole new fresh team of people with some different skill sets. So that's just where my mind goes. It's very complicated. But I love that Jim has thrown out the disaster analogy, because I think that does help us to acknowledge like the seriousness of it. And I think the recovery is equally serious.
Yeah, but I have to echo all of that. I mean, my initial thought, same as Jim, was buildings, because usually after a disaster like a hurricane, you actually get a boost in activity that might look good on paper, but you have to remember rebuilding buildings is just to make up for what was lost. So there's not really any net gain there, even if it creates some activity in the meantime. So of course that's not there. But there's a lot that's much different. I mean, and I think it's driven by the fact that this was just massive. It was everybody, global, right? And as Jim has so artfully pointed out, for a long period of time. And so when that happens, you've really stepped back to reassess a lot of different things. There's going to be cultural shifts, attitudes about how we do things, how we work. Things like remote work that we've talked about. We ran this experiment, realized it works. Now, what is the steady state? How do you do things like maintain culture of your workplace, you know, in a more remote, flexible environment? Is the workforce now national, or, you know, can you hire from anywhere if remote work doesn't matter, you know, is now the way of the future? If I'm a business, why do I need to hire from my community? Maybe I can hire from anywhere. And does that equalize wages in some way across the country? These are discussions that businesses are having now. And if I can hire from any state, why not hire from any country? And so where is the line? Where does it stop, right? To some extent, certain jobs are kind of becoming more national labor market. So attitudes about how we do things like that. But then I think, you know, and Jim and Ann have so beautifully made this point, there's an existential thing that we've gone through as well, about all of us as individuals having to decide things like work-life balance. How much do we want to give to work? You know, when we realize how important and how precious life is, we've all gone through a major conversation about racial equity that is still very much ongoing in ways different than we did before. And COVID wasn't the cause of that, but COVID highlighted some of those fault lines so much in lots of the data that I showed you. And also, you know, emphasizing the importance of things like school and teachers and how we value them in society. The importance of pre-K, as Ann knows, which is something that economists have been on board with for years. They've said, if you're going to spend a policy dollar, put it in preschool, because the gains are so great, so extraordinary. But it's a hard problem to solve, and it's been hard to make that sort of a broader attitude. So the importance of pre-K, even the importance of things like broadband, which, you know, kind of ought to be thought of as sort of a utility, a public utility, but had very unequal access to broadband even today, even in COVID. So, you know, it's just the scale of things. And I think the tentacles of this are much broader than any natural disaster or any recession in the past either, I would say.
That's excellent. And, you know, Jim, did you want to add to that?
Well, I wanted to circle back because Ann said it. I didn't say what I felt like I needed to say. So like my sector, we're going to return back to what we were pre-COVID, because our widget doesn't really change. We care for people. But the school systems, it seems to me the public's perception is that they're working hard to get back to their normal. But so the people I serve still have mental health issues. That didn't change. But the kids they serve, they changed. They're a year behind. Some of those, you know, for a teenager in high school, that year is not so significant like it is for a second grader. The gains that are lost, and to hear, we need to hear the schools around the country at a federal level. There ought to be policy making about what are we going to do the next 2 summers to catch that group up. And we hadn't heard that yet. And that's some of that rebuilding that I think, I hope people smarter than me that are in the right positions are doing that now, because that's what needs to happen. That's the kind of rebuilding that's not the building that got knocked down, but the people that got held back.
Jim, thank you for bringing that up. And Renee, I hope that's something that you can take back to your colleagues, because we've lamented that we haven't yet heard the start of that conversation, and it may be just internal at this point, but we're anxious to see some really proactive measures so that our kids they're a year behind now, some were behind before this year. How can we prevent them being left behind an additional year? And the fear is, do we lose a generation? And it's frightening, I think, to even consider that.
I'd love to, Jim, I want to thank you for pointing that out, because you're right. We haven't lost buildings, but we have lost human capital in some ways. And we are very much concerned about that. And I will absolutely bring that back. We've also done some thinking about that. We've got an educational series that we've launched recently about educational disparities in COVID and how we go about thinking about the students left behind. And the hard thing is it's not everybody. Some students are thriving, right? And that can really risk obscuring the fact that some students really are not in this environment. And so we've done a series to kind of dig into some of those differences and talk to some experts about what can be done about it. So Alexis, if there's an opportunity, maybe I can give some of those resources to this group. I'd love to share them. But I will take that back as well from you all, and thank you.
Yeah, anything you'd like to share, we'll be sending the recording to everyone. So anything you'd like to share, we certainly can pass along. I love this next question. And Renee, I want to start with you. Ann and Jim, you're welcome to chime in. Are we seeing any indication that the departure of women from the workforce is being welcomed by those who think they shouldn't be there anyway? And how do we address this in terms of business strategy, emotional disruption, and community life?
Well, I have not seen that, thankfully. I think that would be so disruptive. What I really hope is the conversation that we've had on racial equity has led to discussion about other forms of equity as well, more broadly. It helps everybody to have that conversation. And I see it in a way that I've never seen it before in my career, not only in my organization, but at the community level. I'm seeing the organizations that I'm a part of discuss this about how we do this differently, how we include groups that historically haven't been included. And while it has been motivated by the racial equity movement, I do believe that that attitude extends to broader groups as well. And I only hope that that continues. So. And I think that it will. I mean, I do see a lot of accountability being put into place right now at the community level. And that's something that I think is an extraordinary shift. So that would be a very alarming trend. I can't say that I've seen it. And in fact, I feel I've seen the opposite, and only hope that persists. But I do think it's valid to say, with this decline that we've had of women in the labor force, we ought to care about that. Representation matters. And it matters to have representation at all levels. And I think that we can solidly say that their evidence is there now.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you haven't heard it. And it would be interesting. We've talked a lot about culture and regional culture within the Commonwealth, and how that question might be answered differently in different parts of Virginia. I think would be really interesting what people have observed. We do have one more question, and that question and your response, Renee, was the perfect lead in. And I open this up to all of our panelists. How can we positively use the pandemic to help kickstart conversations around changing cultural norms around women being primary caregivers, responsible for childcare, doing that work? And before I turn it over to the group, I'm going to take a point of personal privilege and say, you all know I'm in this role. I'm the president and CEO of our chamber. My husband is a senior associate at Dewberry. I don't know anyone who considered that he would stay home when we locked down last March. And like you, Renee, we have a very equitable partnership. Those who know us know that. But I think it's fascinating that the assumption, regardless, and I would say we're peers, different sectors, but certainly at peer levels. And it's fascinating to me that was my own personal experience as well. He could take a Friday and stay home once a week or something like that, but no one suggested that he might do that. So let me turn it over to the group. How would you respond to that? How do we change our norms?
I'll start, because I think I probably have the least interesting response compared to Ann and Jim. I think they've probably got a lot of direct observation on this. And I go back to flexibility again, and this idea that every employer I'm talking to, very, very few have not mentioned that flexibility is going to be the way of the future, and sort of enabling people to manage their lives differently and better. in terms of how we change this conversation about, within the household level about division of labor and division of responsibilities. I think one thing that COVID has done at the personal level, I've seen it, is that it takes all distractions in life away. And so you're very aware of what the issues are in your household with your children. You're not leaving the house every day and going and interacting with other people. You're just keenly focused on all the things in your immediate circle. And that is an opportunity to spark conversations and to revisit one's own wishes and to just have that conversation really frankly. And fortunately, I hope we're in a world where the workplace can better accommodate whatever we decide as individuals is the right path for us. But I'd love to hear what Jim and Ann have to say from the people that they serve on this issue.
You want to go first, Ann?
Wow, this is a loaded question. What comes to my mind, it's kind of like the work at home experiment. It's a forced experience. If anybody had ever said, hey, y'all get it together, communicate more and figure out how you're going to divide up household, the pandemic has really forced this conversation. And I go back to the data that was presented in the beginning. Clearly, for whatever reason, if somebody was going to stay home, it seems like we could guess that it was more women than men. But what we don't know is, how much of that is personal choice, right? So I'm a fan of every family is different. And as long as we can respect those differences and respect that people can figure this out however they want, what I would say, what remains regardless of what works best for any one given family is the need to make sure that we have high quality, accessible childcare for men or women, for families as a whole across the spectrum. To me, that's the bigger question. The rest of it is so personal that I don't know what to say other than the data certainly does suggest that to no one's surprise, women are probably experiencing this a lot different than most men, but that is, a generalization.
My comment would be that, so our workforce is mostly women. We are a helping profession. It tends to draw more women than it does men. And certainly I think as an employer, you heard me say it in my presentation earlier, we needed to be very mindful that if we wanted a workforce to continue to make our widgets, that we needed to be mindful of what their needs were as a workforce and to be flexible. And that's not an easy thing to do for traditional workplaces. We're a public entity, so we're like a government agency. And a lot of our structure is very, very rigid and doesn't like that. How can I pay you if you're not working today? I mean, we still have to find the balance in there and we still have to do the right thing, but the pandemic allowed us to recognize that that could be done differently. And even the work from home thing, I mean, I've been on Zoom calls where, you heard the doorbell for Renee, but you've seen a little kid run behind them. Kids are fascinated. They want to see themselves on the screen. And for some people that's a spine tingling. Oh my God, my toddler's on the screen and there are 80 people watching me. I mean, we need to be flexible enough to realize we're all human beings. We all were children at one time. We all have our own children, and that very well could be us too. So I think that has opened up our mind to the world can be different. In our field, we've said that the telehealth bottle, the genie is out of that. And we're never going to go back to having, we've always had this traditional model of really all healthcare. I've got to touch you. Doctors have to palpitate, is your belly soft? Do you have a pulse? That kind of stuff. Now, some of that you're never going to get away from in healthcare, but can you have a consultation with your doctor and not have to go into the office? Well, the pandemic forced that to happen. I know in our culture, we were all about doing everything face-to-face. That was what the payers, the insurance companies say you got to do it. Well, we found out that you don't have to, that you can do many things differently. Renee said earlier, the cultures and the widget making is different. Pittsylvania County is the largest county in Virginia, it's the size of Rhode Island almost. Sometimes half of our staff's day was travel, driving all the way up to Gretna, then driving from Gretna to Java. Well, we eliminated all that. And it meant that people in their 8-hour day might see 2 or 3 more people a day. So people are more productive. We're getting out into somebody's life and making a difference a little bit easier. So those are some of the things that I think can make a difference. And the other thing I want to say about families and being at home together and stuff, it's forced you to work on your relationships and be there with your family in different ways, work through stress. You can't walk away from it. You know, if there's a fight about something, you're all going to be there and deal with it. So I hope most people see that as an opportunity, whether they articulate like this, like, oh, that was a learning experience for me, or they just naturally figured out better ways to deal with their fellow humans that they're sharing a house with.
I lament that it's 4:57 because I think this is a really interesting and compelling conversation, one that I'd love to continue in some form or fashion. There have been so many things that come up. This idea, this notion of this being a disaster, we need to treat it with the gravity of a disaster if we're going to effectively recover. I've heard that quite a bit. I've heard that we need to respect each other's choices regarding employment and family structure and childcare options and all of those things. And I've heard something that we've been seeing at the chamber, and I'm so excited that we've been seeing it even for the last 8 months, is how do we capitalize on this disaster? And I don't mean that in a disingenuous kind of way, but how do we make the most? How do we make positive changes in our families, at our organizations? How can we do better by our communities? And so I think there have been some positives, not to move away and not to recognize that we want to acknowledge and recognize the devastation that's occurred, but also to acknowledge the good things that have come from this and how maybe as a community, as a society, we can come out better and stronger. Jim and Renee, you all are amazing. Thank you for the work that you do in our communities and across Virginia and other parts of our country. Want to thank Teresa Wiseman and our friends at Danville Toyota for their support in making these programs possible. Want to thank each of you for being here today. Your support means everything to us and allows us to offer these programs to you. So keep coming. Let's continue the conversation. And we wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Lovely being with you.